Hello. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Shining Light on Shadows, a candid conversation about mental health. Our guest for this episode, episode 30, is Aisha Sultan. She's the host of a PBS series on mental health, Things We Don't Talk About. My name is Neil Parekh. I'm your producer and co-host. And Dawn, no, that way, is my co-host and very, very good friend. We started this show in February of last year. It's kind of hard to believe that we've gone a year plus, 2 episodes a month for the most part, except for November and December, really.
Yeah.
And this is. I want to remind people that May is Mental Health Awareness Month, it's kind of in that sense ironic because it's like every month is Mental Health Awareness Month for us with the show, and particularly Dawn on Facebook. I say this every episode, so for the folks who are watching who are regulars, thank you for bearing with me, but I take a lot of inspiration from Dawn for her candor and her sharing on Facebook. I aspire to that. I have shared much more, at least about my own mental health through the show, but still not there in terms of Facebook. But on a production note, I'll just let people know before we get too far along that we are live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, Instagram, and my website. So we certainly want to encourage folks to let us know where you're watching from and to leave a comment. For everyone watching on replay, thank you for doing that. I want to give a quick shout out to Digimentors, the production firm that I work with. We do social media, digital and virtual events, and they give me the time and space to produce this show, so I'm always grateful for that. One of the things that I've learned over the last year is how important it is to talk about what you're going through, and I know for me this week has been challenging. Just a big sense of overwhelm, not being able to manage everything, feeling like I'm just not getting everything done when I want to, the way I want to do it. It's been hard. It's been hard.
Yeah. It's funny that the title of today's show is Things We Don't Talk About. Because I have had a very, very difficult 2 weeks. Probably two of the harder weeks that I've had in a very long time. And and I just posted on Facebook not but 10 minutes, well, maybe half an hour before this show, about how functional depression is a real thing. You can put this like really good mask on and you can joke around, and you get everything done that you're supposed to get done for the most part. And at the same time, you're just kind of like floating through your mind. And I've had a lot of anxiety and a pretty decent bout of depression the last 2 weeks. And I was telling Jim, my husband, right before the show, that I feel so floaty. And anybody who has ever had like this disassociation where you're just like everything is too much, and so you just kind of like disassociate from life, you get this very floaty feeling. And in therapy they tell you that's when you need to like put your feet firmly on the ground, like really ground yourself. That's what, if you ever heard the word grounding and you don't know what it means, that's really what it is, where you're just feeling so not present in your own body that you have to find a way to connect yourself to the earth so that you can kind of come back down. And that's very much the space that I've been in. And Neil was incredibly gracious and said, I didn't even ask you if you wanted to do the show or not, because I knew that you would say that you would do it. But he did say, like, don't ever feel like you can't say that, you can't do the show for any reason. But I knew that this show today and our amazing guest that's going to be on would actually be very therapeutic and helpful for me. And my job throughout this show is to keep myself from not crying and stay present. So bear with me.
Well,
And thanks for letting me be candid about that, Neil.
no, of course. And what I'd say is that, one note is that I do remember last year, in June, in fact, I was so overwhelmed. I didn't have time to set up the show, and we rescheduled it. We pushed it off. It was, that was a moment of self-care. The other thing is I did also think that if I even asked you whether or not you wanted to not co-host or postpone the show, that you might reach through the computer and bite my head off, because
Most likely.
I know you feel so strongly about this, and
I do.
it's one of those things where I think that even if we're having a hard time, I think the best thing that we can do for ourselves first and foremost, and for the show itself and people who are watching, is to be willing to be vulnerable and to say that, what, I'm not feeling it today. And I appreciate, I'm never going to comment on makeup, Dawn, but you said that you put on lipstick before the show and you pull yourself together to be able to do this. And sometimes, if you can do even that much, that's a huge victory. So
For
I
sure.
just want to acknowledge that.
Thank you. Thank you.
A few quick hellos for people who are watching. My mom is watching from Hastings on Hudson, New York. So the Parek is a very loyal viewer. So thank you, Mom. Appreciate it. And Apollo is watching from Philadelphia. So glad to be here, champs. And I think he's talking about you in particular. And then our other favorite, Jim, is saying hello, Dawn and Neil. Love you both, though I love the blonde a little bit more. So now you're going to make me go get the blonde wig I have to compete. I'm just saying. And then you're going to have to think about that. Kate Easton is watching as well and says hello. Naomi is watching from a rainy Rhode Island. Thank you, Naomi. It's so great when people show up and watch. Our guest today is really incredible. Aisha Sultan is a columnist with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and she has put together this series called Things We Don't Talk About, a 12-part series on the local PBS station in St. Louis, 9 PBS. And they cover issues such as addiction, partner violence, anxiety, depression, intergenerational conflict, immigration trauma, sexual abuse, which of course we've talked about several times on this show. So we're looking forward to having her join us, talking about the show, but also more importantly, talking about her own journey and her own experience, particularly with therapy and kind of how she's emerged as a mental health advocate. So with that, I want to bring on our guest, Aisha Sultan.
Hi, Neil.
Aisha?
Hi, Dawn. I'm excited to be in conversation with you guys. I'm a fan of the work that you guys have been doing for a long time. And Dawn, I just want to say that as someone who cries easily, it's totally fine if you cry at any point during this conversation.
Thank you.
I'll probably start crying along with you. So just, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aisha. I have to say that just first and foremost, it's always great, and we've had several people on the show who are South Asian background. Yourself, obviously, Pradnya Haldapur was a recent guest. We also had Indra Somani, another colleague from SAJA, the South Asian Journalists Association. It's not, mental health is not something that society in general is comfortable talking about, but it's particularly a big stigma in immigrant communities and the South Asian community as well. Before we talk about your series, I want to ask you about your personal experience with mental health and treatment. What brought you to this space where you can now talk about mental health when did you first start exploring these issues?
Well, as a journalist, I'd always been interested because I write a lot about families and people's personal stories and about how policy impacts families. And so, of course, a lot of what happens in society and what affects interpersonal relationships and people's own sense of well-being is related to mental health. So I feel like I've always sort of had that interest and it's been a part of my writing. But personally, I sort of assumed that if you were, working and meeting expectations at your job and in a good relationship and taking care of your responsibilities, then you were doing fine, even if you felt really stressed out or overwhelmed at times or very anxious, that was just part of living in a stressful, high pressure society and life. And that kind of changed for me during the pandemic. I think a lot of people had a moment. Well, first of all of our stressors tripled, doubled, quadrupled, and the risks around us got so much more. And as a journalist, and as someone who has a spouse who's a healthcare worker and children who are at home, not from school, there was just like so much piling up. I felt more stressed out than I had felt in a very long time. And I'd made an appointment for someone else who backed out of it at the last minute to talk to a therapist who I knew was very good. So rather than cancel the appointment, I said, you know what? Maybe this therapist will give me some strategies on just how to deal with my anxiety because I feel so anxious all the time. And it was in that conversation. Well, first of all, I felt a lot better just being able to sort of vent to somebody who I didn't feel like I was burdening them. I think that's something else. Like I'm the firstborn, I'm a child of immigrants. Like I didn't want to dump on someone, add to somebody else's worries or whatever. So I felt better just having someone to talk to. But then in the process of having conversations with this therapist, I realized, oh my gosh, there's all this stuff in my life that I just sort of pushed aside, and never really wanted to deal with because it was painful or difficult, or I didn't have language to deal with it. That if I talk about it, I actually feel a lot better about things that were either sad or painful or hurtful. Or maybe I didn't realize things that happened to me when I was younger made me respond to stressors as an adult in a certain way. And I had no idea that was happening to me until I went through this myself. And then after I did, I said, okay, well, more people in my community should know about this. And like you said, in the South Asian community, it's not very openly talked about. I think there's a lot of concern about appearances and everybody just wants to look like they have it all together and they're so happy and so successful. And you know what? I'm grateful to be happy and successful and loving what I do and having a wonderful family. But I'm the first person to say that like life is hard. We've all experienced trauma and we all go through difficult times. And for me, at least, the process of unpacking a lot of that with someone who's trained to do that was extraordinarily helpful.
And that was the first time you'd gone to therapy?
Yeah, it was the first time I had like gone through that process myself. It was, and I was, quite old. And so I wish I had done it a lot sooner in my life, because I realized you don't have to be as reactive as you are. You don't have to be as anxious. There are ways to I just realized you can feel better about certain things, and I never knew that was possible.
So I have a question for you because, you kind of alluded to the fact that I didn't think that there was anything major in my life. And I think there's this really big misnomer that says that unless you've had something really horrible happen to you, or your parents got divorced, or something really bad happened in your childhood, that those are the times that you go to therapy. But you mentioned something about the fact that we all have some traumas in our lives, no matter what our circumstances or situation. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. I think that I really underestimated how, as a child, okay, so what I realized is as a child, especially a child of immigrants, you are focused on surviving and meeting expectations and, I was the only person of my racial and ethnic background in a lot of the spaces that I was in growing up, and that all of that takes a toll on you. Like all of that, all of that for years and years builds up. And if you've never really had a space to discuss it, talk about it, or feel validated about it, or say things that you haven't been able to say before, you know, I don't know. I didn't realize that some of the things, some things that people might not see as big T trauma can still have an impact on your mental health and can still affect the way that you feel. Um, I know that knowing a little bit about your story, you had like an extremely traumatic childhood and upbringing. And and I think that's what it was, is that I felt like I wasn't worthy or I didn't deserve it because I had parents who loved me. You know what? If I have parents who love me and I have a roof over my head and food in the fridge and I wasn't, I mean, then what right do I have to talk about my mental health? That was like a huge hurdle for me.
Aisha,
Yeah.
you talked about growing up as the child of immigrants. I am as well. I think we're of the same generation, the first generation born here,
Right.
having to contend with, kind of the living in two cultures, one culture at school, one culture at home type thing. Just for context, because I wonder if it's part of that story, for people like you and me who grew up in an immigrant family. I think the geographic location, the community that you grew up in, is a factor.
Right.
Depending on kind of where your parents are, what your larger community is like. If you're the only South Asian family for miles around, or a very few small community, that's going to have a different kind of dynamic than if you're. I grew up outside New York City,
Right.
Westchester County. My parents were very active in the Indian community. They helped start the India Day Parade and all this. Like I grew up around all of that. It was still had its challenges, but I'm just curious about what your
right. So I grew up in a suburb of Houston, Texas, which at the time, this particular suburb was predominantly white, predominantly Christian. I think my family was, in a high school of 3,000 students. Me and my sisters, me and my siblings were like the only Muslims, or, one of maybe a handful, and certainly the only Pakistani American family. And it was in the South, it was in Texas. So there was, I had to contend with a fair amount of ignorance and racism in, ugliness. And at the time you're just like, okay, well, everybody has to deal with something. Like everybody's getting tormented or bullied about something. But I think that, I think my sense of alienation growing up was really intense, and not necessarily feeling accepted or feeling a sense of belonging in either community that I was in, and desperately like trying to figure out where it was I fit in, where it was I was accepted, where I was that I was understood. And that's a lifelong journey, but definitely in your early adolescence and 20s, you're trying to find your place and you're trying to find your voice. And at that time, and there's also a lot of expectation. I mean, Neil, I don't know if you internalized it as much as I did, but I knew my parents gave up everything. I knew they weren't seeing their families, and I knew that they had sacrificed so much. And the expectation was, I had internalized that. Didn't even have to be said, that we expect you to do all of, to be excellent in all these ways. But I wanted to be, because I wanted to make their sacrifice worth it for them.
That's a classic issue for immigrant children, and I know that it's different in every situation, and it plays out differently. I don't think that I felt the same kind of pressure with my family, with my parents, but I will share my wife's family story. So my wife was born here. Her mom was born here, but her grandparents came here as refugees. They actually fled Iran when after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, they literally walked from Tehran to Bombay to get to, because they were fleeing kind of war and conflict. And Pam grew up hearing these stories about how her grandfather, the struggles he had to get here to get a better life for his family, and like that pressure definitely passed down. She definitely felt that.
Well, and I do think there's something to be said. We've talked about this a little bit about like what's happened in generations prior and the stories that we carry in our bodies from prior generations. You know, I don't really quite know how it works biologically, but I know psychologically, knowing that my grandparents fled India during partition, during this horrible, bloody, traumatic time. And my father was also very, very young when that happened. And then my father had to leave his country. Both my parents did, but my father did first, to start all over again. And then, I mean, just this sense of like the generations before me have had to leave everything. I mean, and that is traumatic. That's a huge trauma, you know? And then also, you know, Neil, I don't want to underestimate the moment that we're in this country, like politically, and that we've been in for the past decade. There is a legitimate fear for some of us that very easily we might not be welcome here. Very easily we might have to find a way to flee. Very quickly our fortunes can change. I mean, that's a very real fear.
Sure.
Because of what's happening in the country around us, in the politics. Sure. And so there's this sense of like, oh my gosh, am I going to be yet another generation of people in my family that have had to leave their home and everything they've built for safety, for survival?
So I want to bring in, we talked about the show, Things We Don't Talk About, this 12-part series that you have. And you know, one of the topics that you cover is immigration trauma. Right. So I want to bring up a quick clip, and then we can talk more about that. So here is the clip real quick, and I'll press play.
Tell me a little bit about how common this is for immigrants or even children of immigrants.
Almost 50% of the immigrants, one member of their family, go through immigration trauma.
In retrospect, she said, you know, I felt like I couldn't afford to be anxious. I couldn't afford to be depressed.
But what compels a person to hurt themselves?
It is not being able to identify healthy coping mechanisms to deal with stressors in life.
That was
how
quick
would a person
in terms
know
of the
if they
clip.
Are...
But that was a quick bit just about the immigration experience.
Right. This was a compilation of clips from different shows, and the first one we watched was a conversation about the immigration. And Neil, I will say that one of my intentions in making this program was so that in communities where there is still some stigma and where there is less access or less people avail themselves less of mental health therapies, I wanted to have it be in conversation with us and with these communities particularly. Sure. I mean, these conversations are for everyone, you know.
Sure.
But in particularly, I wanted people to see therapists who look like them, or who have come, or psychiatrists who've come from similar backgrounds from them, or whose families have the same cultural expectations that we don't talk about our families outside the family, or we don't bring, we don't bring shame by discussing things that might make you look bad or make us look bad. You know what I mean? So that was really important to me in this show.
So before we move on to talk more about intergenerational trauma, I want to bring on a comment from Kieran, who is a colleague of ours and who was helped you with the series. She gave the H-Town shout out earlier when you were talking about Houston. But she says the weight of immigrant trauma on our generation is at once a no-brainer and mind-blowing. Aisha's show taps into this in a way no one ever has, calling you a trailblazer.
That's very kind of her. Yeah.
Kieran, thank you for watching, and thank you for your support of the show. Dawn, I know you've done some work around intergenerational trauma. right?
I have. I've done some research on non-white women intergenerational trauma, and it is absolutely astounding the physiological, like what happens inside the body, generation to generation, when there's just been this cycle of trauma over and over and over again. Like it affects your heart, it affects your reproductive system, it affects everything. And there's a whole lot of studies about losing a child before the age of 1, and the effects of generational trauma on that alone is huge. So.
Oh, that's so interesting, because a lot of people in my father's generation lost siblings before the age of 1. They had big families, and a lot of children survive. I mean, that happened in both my parents' families.
Yeah, there's a tie.
Is that just, Aisha, I want to ask about that. Is that in terms of losing siblings, was that just from where they were in terms of geography and access to care, and kind of, like, if you look back at a generation or 2 generations, maybe even 3, a lot of children didn't survive early childhood.
Right. You know what? That's an interesting question, because honestly, that's not even something that my parents have really talked very much with me about. I mean, I don't even know that I've even asked.
That's, see, and I'm going to be asking for forgiveness later versus permission, but I'm going to keep talking about my wife, because she had a brother who died of SIDS when she was 3 years old, and I know that I haven't talked to her so much about how it directly impacted her, but it impacted her parents, and it impacted how they raised her and her. She had a sister after that, but the decisions they made and how they raised their kids certainly were impacted by that experience.
I mean, how would that not? It would change everything. Well, it changes everything.
And she didn't understand when she was in high school, for example, like why she couldn't join a class trip or join friends taking the bus to Boston from Middle Connecticut, right? Like the concern that her parents had of keeping her safe was like much higher, much heightened than I want to say average parents, but parents in general have a heightened sense of a need for security and safety. But for her, it was until she really understood the connection, she just didn't get it when she was growing up.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And our parents are also of the generation where they don't have the language or really the permission or space to talk about these things, even with their own children. Like, my father and his generation never really talked about what happened during partition or what they saw or what, and a lot of people saw very brutal things, really traumatic things. And I mean, 1 million people died. 1 million people were killed, right? And it was horrible. And so and you think that, oh, if I forget about it, I'm starting new. Like, this is something you guys can both attest to, is that just because you don't talk about it doesn't mean that it doesn't still live inside you.
Oh yeah.
And it doesn't mean that it's not going to manifest in your life somehow. Like, whether it's because you get angry very quickly, or because you have an undiagnosed depression or anxiety that you can't cope with things, or your relationships are strained, or, it can be a million different ways. But just because like you can't face it, or you don't want to face it, or you don't want to go back there, doesn't mean that it's not going to just still manifest in your life.
And even if you do want to go there, it still manifests in their lives. My children were incredibly affected by the trauma that I experienced. And I, had therapy and talked about it a lot, but talk about that safety issue. I mean, my poor children weren't allowed to go into anybody's house alone ever. Like they didn't have sleepover experiences and things like that. I wouldn't let them do a lot of things, and it shaped their life.
Sure. I want to bring in this comment from Apollo, who's watching from Philadelphia. in the clip that we showed earlier, healthy coping skills as opposed to any coping mechanisms is key. How people address their psychology does matter. Awareness and having the language to articulate their psychology is even better.
Right. And that's something that comes up in one of the episodes, is that I asked the question, well, what if someone doesn't want to get help for this? What if someone doesn't want to talk about this or doesn't want to go on medication? And one thing that came up is that, well, we do find other ways to cope, whether it's by drinking too much or whatever behaviors, self-harm. I mean, it can be a million different things that still hurt us and still impact our life or in our relationships. But it doesn't mean that your body's not trying to find some way to deal with the discomfort inside of it.
What of the different episodes that you've done? So we'll take a step back. This is a long-term project, right? When did you start working on this series? When was the concept?
Okay. So I would say, I guess I started talking to a therapist in 2020. So the start of 2021, I thought I got this idea that, let me see if I can do something to reach more people about this. Because I've also written a lot of stories for the newspaper and for news sites about mental health. So I would say in 2021, I sort of thought about what would it look like, who would be on it, what would some of the topics be. I talked to so many different therapists and psychiatrists about case studies and what are some common issues that come up, what are some cultural challenges that they face, like with patients, different populations. And then the next year I had to raise money because I had to hire a crew to shoot it, to edit it, and all of that. And so then we were actually able to have production time where we shot all the episodes. Then there's post-production. So and now it's finally on the air. So I would say it probably took about 3 years, start to finish, of just constantly chipping away. I mean, I also have a full-time job and a family and everything. So I couldn't devote myself full-time to it, but it was something I felt so strongly about, that I just thought I got to keep trying. And, I applied for a bunch of grants to try to get the money to, get it all together. And some of them didn't come through, but a few of them did. And there were some people who believed in the project and, were donors from the very beginning. And I'm really grateful for that too.
And so you're putting these episodes out. So you've already recorded them. They've been edited.
They've all been shot.
Produced,
they've all been delivered to the television station. Yes.
But you're doing this in conjunction with a local library as well, right? You're doing some events there.
Yes. And, this has been really interesting because I do feel like, well, not everybody watches PBS, and eventually they'll all be on YouTube. So people will be able to just watch them whenever they want. But there's something to be said about being in a space with other people and being able to talk about your experience and feel like you're being heard. There's something really valuable in that experience. So, for May, I'm doing these 4 talks on 4 different topics where we screen the episode. It's open to the community. And then I usually invite one of the therapists or psychiatrists who was on an episode to come join me. And then we have a Q&A. And really in the Q&A, people want to talk about their stuff. They want to talk about what they've been through, what their families have been through. They want to be heard. And this has been really successful. So I think we're going to do these are all libraries in the county, but we're going to do libraries in the city next. And also colleges, universities, different organizations, like student organizations. I just want people, I think having conversations in groups with people feels really therapeutic to me. I don't know if you guys have ever had that experience, when other people are talking about what they've been through, it makes you think about what you've been through in different ways.
Go
ahead,
Dawn.
I was just going to say one of my, and not that I'm trying to plug my book, but one of my favorite things to do is really to go to libraries and give library talks and give people the opportunity to ask questions and to talk about their own experiences. And that's really therapeutic, I think. So I like that you do that.
I think the reason is because I really crave connection with people. I think connection gives me a sense of belonging to a place, to a community. And so even with the films that I've made, I always loved when we would screen them in a theater or at a film festival, because you get to experience it with something that you've made and created with other people and hear them respond and react to it. Because most of the work I've done, writing, people read it in isolation, and then you'll get an email or a text or a message, but you're not there right with them experiencing it and having a conversation about it right then and there. And that, to me, I don't know, it feels great to me, even sometimes when the feedback is, hard. And it still makes me feel like, okay, this is a moment in which I'm connecting with another human being on something that's like, in both of us are being vulnerable about it.
I've actually been, so we've talked about this on the show. I've been in therapy, seeing a therapist since just after college. The gaps that I've had are really from when I've moved from one place to another and haven't found another therapist. But I never had been in any kind of group setting before, any kind of group discussion or therapy. And last fall, I was diagnosed with adult ADHD, and that took me several months to kind of wrap my head around. Mm-hmm. But I did join this coaching group, and those conversations have been really helpful. A chance to share some common experiences, even just when there's a question out there, and you have 5 people, 6 people all saying, "Yep, exactly." Every day, exactly how, that's very affirming. But you also have a chance to share your own experience, and some things that may work for you, you actually can maybe help someone else as well, which is really, really interesting.
And I also think that just being able to give voice to something that you've experienced, like, there's healing in that too.
Yeah.
I mean, Dawn, do you feel like by taking ownership of your story and being able to tell your own story of the terribly traumatic things that have happened to you have helped you heal?
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah, absolutely. And I think being in spaces with people who have also had, traumatic experiences, especially around sexual assault, I think is healing in and of itself. Like, I've heard a lot of people who have experienced trauma like this who do the same thing as I did. Like, you're so curious about like forensic science and so curious about like, the shows about homicide and like things like that. You're just like so drawn to it because, a lot of times you feel like, oh, that could have been me. It's almost like that therapeutic thing when you get around people and they're telling these stories and that they have experienced those same feelings that you've experienced. So yeah, for sure. And you just turned interviewer on me.
Well, that's our job.
I know.
How could she avoid that, right?
That is definitely my natural impulse, is to start asking people questions. No, but I mean, I do think about that too, because I do ask questions for a living, but I also feel like being on the other side of that with a therapist was, I don't know, it was like a really, it helped me get to know myself better. I will say that. I feel like I got to, I mean, and I'm 51 now. And so I guess I did this in my late 40s. And I just thought, I wonder what stopped me from like wanting to talk to a therapist or anybody like when I was in my 20s or 30s. And really what it was is time. I had no time. And that's another thing I think sometimes people do when they don't want to cope or think about difficult things, is they make themselves, I made myself extremely busy all the time, constantly. Like, so I had no rest. And I think it was probably some kind of coping mechanism, an unhealthy one.
I'm curious, Aisha, in terms of your experience having started therapy during the pandemic, in 2020, when you were a few years older, it's not that long ago. We're the same age, by the way.
Okay.
So it's a good reference point. I'm curious about your comfort level in talking about being in therapy, because until I started the show last year with Dawn, I had never uttered the words therapist before out
Mm.
loud. I never would have told anyone that I was in therapy or that I had anxiety and depression. And now it's been reframed. It's my ADHD that is causing the anxiety and depression. But I never said those words. I was too afraid of what people would think if I actually said that. What was your experience as you started therapy? And I mean, was it something you were able to talk to people about,
Well,
or
I think amongst my closest friends and family, like, people who I feel like wouldn't judge me or wouldn't, be supportive of it, I did, say, yeah, I'm talking to a therapist and I find it to be really helpful and it's helping me deal with my anxiety and everything. But then I think because I write publicly and, I post a lot about my life publicly, it took me some time to get comfortable with the idea of telling people that the reason I made this show is because I myself benefited so much from this. And I don't know why that is. I mean, I guess it's like it feels kind of private, like this was my own personal experience and maybe I don't want to share it with the world. But if I do a cost benefit analysis of, well, maybe if I talk openly about this, it will encourage someone else to do this, and then they might be helped from it or their children might be helped from it, then a feeling of discomfort for me is not so great, and it's worth it, like the trade-off is worth it to be able to say, yeah, I'm willing to talk about this because I think it can help you too.
but it wasn't until you did the show that you shared that. So a
Yeah.
few years after,
Yeah.
and in the context of the show, like there was a
Right. There was a reason.
a reason, right? You didn't just write a column one day
No,
and say, "Hey,
did not.
everyone, by the way."
No, I didn't. You're right. I didn't do that. No. Yeah. And I think partly in the back of my mind, once I got the idea for the show, well, when I was going through therapy, and the pandemic and the kids and my husband, it's COVID and everything, I had no bandwidth to think about sharing that experience. Like I was just trying to get through it. Oh my God, it was such a difficult time. It was so difficult. But then once I felt like we got through it and I got the idea in my head that I want to do a show like this and this is why I want to do it, I had this feeling that when I talk about why I did this, I'm going to tell people, so I felt like maybe I was saving the story for then. Like this is something, I want you to know how personal this was for me because it was super personal, And Dawn, you were talking about how you feel when you're, I don't know what the word is, like, what was the word you used to describe about depression when you're still able to do everything? What is that?
Functional
Yeah,
depression.
functional depression. So I am curious about how you felt inside. You talked about this feeling of floatingness, disassociation, but did you feel a lack of joy, a lack of pleasure, sadness, grief? Like, what did you feel inside when that happened?
Yeah. I mean, lots of just self-doubt and a feeling like of worthlessness and I'm not good enough. Why am I even getting out of bed? No one's all I'm gonna do is mess everything up. Like these terrible, I say all the time, the things that I say to myself when I'm in depression, I would not say to my worst enemy. I bully myself. I say horrible, horrible things. It's shameful, very shameful. But during that bout of depression, it's nearly impossible to shut that off. And people will say, like, well, just don't do that. Like, put positive affirmations on your mirror. Like, I look at those positive affirmations and I turn them around. I'm like, yep, nope, they're not talking to you. So yeah, like just a lot of really, really bad body shaming, like just the whole gamut of things that are just not good.
And so it's like a constant thought in your head, like constant negativity about yourself, about,
Yes.
and then also, is it in your physical body, like exhaustion,
Yep.
pain, all of that?
Yeah. Yep. I'll feel sick to my stomach. I won't want to eat. I have really bad like headaches where like that floating feeling is just like making my head hurt. Yeah, it's very physical.
And so then, how does it clear? How does it get better?
My husband and I always say it's time. A lot of it is time. A lot of it is appropriate, like coping mechanisms, like grounding myself,
Mhm.
reminding myself that this is temporary, allowing myself to feel not okay. Like you have said, I'm a busybody, right? I will spend every minute, even in the depths of functional depression, I will spend every waking minute trying to fill my time with something so I don't have to think, which is why I don't sleep at night, because that when I lay down to sleep is when I'm doing nothing and then my brain just won't shut off. So it's just a terrible cycle. And it's sometimes it takes 2 days, sometimes it takes a week. It's, it just depends.
So one of the shows that I did that I felt very strongly, I felt strongly about all of them, but one was about people who have the fear of taking medication, psychiatric medication. And sometimes there can be a strong cultural component to that too. Like in certain cultures, it's just people just really are not about that, and there's a lot of fears about side effects, about getting addicted, about so many different things. And I'm just wondering, like, was that something that helped you, hurt you, didn't work for you? Because I think there's this feeling that, like, okay, well, if you get the right medications and you've talked to a therapist and you've done the work, then you should be better. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, it doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that. I mean, a lot of those medications are mood stabilizers. That doesn't mean that you don't feel depressed or that you don't feel anxiety. It's it depends upon the level of where you're at. I've done medication before. I mean, my son could not function in life without medication. It's just something that really helps him stabilize. So I'm not against that at all. I have absolutely no fear about that at all. Yeah, I guess that's what I have to say about that.
But it's just sort of like, it's just sort of comes and goes anyway, like sort of chronically.
It does. It's just, I think it's like any kind of pain that you have in your body and you take medication for it. It's still there. But sometimes it's worse than other times.
Oh, that's a really interesting way. I'm learning so much from this conversation with you right now. Because there are things I haven't understood. And because people on my show have been experts, like either therapists or psychiatrists, I didn't feel comfortable asking patients to come on my show because it's just such a personal thing. Like you guys, invite people to talk about their personal situations. But I just felt like conflicted about that. Because I just felt like it was out there forever. And I don't know, what if somebody regrets it later or what? I don't know.
I'll tell you, we have not had a problem getting guests for this show in almost a year and a half. I think people are eager. They are eager to talk about their mental health experiences. And we do say, like, don't talk about anything that you don't feel comfortable talking about, that you might regret.
Right.
Because I do think that that's a possibility. Sorry, Neil, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that I think one of the things that has meant the most to me, Aisha, we've had several people who've come on the show and shared their mental health experience for the first time publicly. It's one thing, for example, our guest last week, Amanda Krantz, shared about the challenges of having lost her daughter when her daughter was 3 months old, and the need for resilience, and keeping she had 4 other children that she had to be a mother for. That's the kind of trauma obviously you don't wish on anyone, and can't imagine what that would be like to go through. But she has also spoken about it over the last several years publicly, and has been active and has been an advocate.
Mhm.
So that's I put that in kind of one category. But we had a guest, um, Melissa Lutke, who is a journalist. I've interviewed her, or we've interviewed her on Sri's show, the Sunday New York Times Read Along. She worked for Sports Illustrated back in the 70s, and a short stint as a sports journalist, but she led the way to open up men's locker rooms for women journalists, and she wrote a book about it. And she's been on my email list. I've told her about the show, and she told me soon after we launched the show that I'd be happy to talk about my own experience with mental health. This was from 30 years ago, that she had clinical depression, and she'd never told anyone, and she never shared it. And we had several people like that. So it's every guest is special. Every guest it really means a lot that people are willing to share their story. But I give extra credit for people who are willing to share it for the first time.
Oh yeah, that's huge. And the thing that makes mental wellness and mental illness so mysterious is that you can't see it like a broken leg, or you can't measure it in lab, and everyone's experience is so unique and individual to them. So that's why I was so curious about how you felt inside, because the way you feel when you're depressed can be very different than how someone else feels. The way I feel when I feel very anxious or awake at night because I can't sleep, my mind is racing and I feel it in my body, is going to be very different than someone else who has social anxiety or some other kind of, anxiety. And I think that's what lends itself to this idea of like not really knowing how to talk about it or how to get help for it, because it feels so individual and hidden inside of us.
But what's interesting about that is, and I agree with that wholeheartedly. Like, I can't say that my experience is any, is the same as anybody else's. Right. Yet every time I talk about, like, when I'm depressed, how I feel on the inside, somebody will say, "Oh my God, I am so glad you said that, because this is how I feel. This is how this manifests in me. I'm glad to hear that someone else has like physical symptoms." Because like you said, it's not like a broken arm. Right. And like when you feel so like sick to your stomach that you don't even want to go to work, but you don't have the stomach flu or a disease or some other thing, you can't just say, "Hey, I can't come into work today because I'm depressed and my stomach hurts because of that." That's not how that works.
Right.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting.
No, absolutely. I was just about to say something else. What was it? Oh, and another thing is about how at different ages and stages of your life, your mental health evolves also and is affected by so many other things, like postpartum depression, or because your hormones are so much in flux after having a baby, or when you go through perimenopause or menopause, your hormones are totally whack, which affects so much about how our brain and bodies feel. There was a book that my therapist told me to read. I don't know if you guys have read it, but it's called The Body Keeps the Score. And I mean, it's a seminal work on how our psychological health impacts our physical health. And it was really eye-opening for me. So if anybody's watching who has not read this book, and it just explained and helped me understand so many things. It's called The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I want to just give a quick announcement for our next episode coming up June 12th. Jonathan Boorstein is going to be our guest, talking about mature adults and mental health challenges. We touched on this earlier in the episode. Aisha, you talked about your father, and Dawn, we've talked about your father in the past as well. But Jonathan is going to share his own experience with mental health, and we're so looking forward to that conversation. We are live the second and fourth Thursdays of the month, so the second Thursday in June is June 12th. We hope you have a chance to join us for that conversation.
I feel like I learned more from you guys than you probably got from me out of this conversation.
No, not at all.
Not at all.
Kate says it's such a great book. The body keeps the score.
I just actually text her and said, "Can you let me borrow that book, please?" Kate's my best friend. I'm like, I need to borrow that book.
Yeah,
absolutely. I want to bring in one more clip from your show, Aisha. I think the question that you pose in this clip is really relevant and telling. It's this idea: is anxiety normal? So let's just take a look at that real quick.
How common is depression in our society?
I don't think 25% of us need to be on medication, but I think there are a lot of people out there who would benefit from medicine who are not on medication.
And then we'll bring it back to the anxiety one as well, because I really like that one. Right, I think here.
Yeah.
So first of all, isn't anxiety normal?
So it is a normal emotion. The time it becomes abnormal is when it is so severe, it's affecting your daily life, your work, your relationships.
How do I know if that's like disordered eating?
Just really quick hits, but you're right. I like how you bring in experts to kind of share their perspective. We've done that as well. We brought in a few therapists, advocates. It's a range of people that we've been able to talk to.
Well, and I also I wanted to ask them questions that someone who's never been in therapy, like questions that I didn't know the answers to. Like, do you just show up and start talking about yourself? It's so weird. Like, how does that work? Do you ask me questions? Am I just supposed to start saying stuff? And like, what if I don't want to tell you something? If I tell you something, could it get someone else in trouble? Like, I asked them all these questions. And, what if I don't believe in taking medication? Then what are you going to do with me? Like, am I going to fail therapy? Or, I mean, I don't know. And also even something very simple, like how do you find a therapist that really works for you? Like, do I just start Googling therapist? How do I know if it's going to be someone who even understands me? And how much is this going to cost? Like, I mean, I think these are really real questions that people have, because it's not always easy to find a therapist, to make time to go see one, to make sure it's a good fit, to find out how much it's going to cost you, even if you have insurance. And if you don't, who is going to see me if I don't have insurance? I mean, that's all real stuff.
Very practical. And it takes time. I know that for myself, like I had to see when I moved to Seattle, and then when I had a difficult experience finding a therapist, the first one that I went to wasn't a good fit. And it took about 3 or 4 sessions to really understand that, yeah, this is not going to work out. This is not what I need in terms of the style and the conversation. And I know too many people who, when they've reached out to get a therapist, the wait times are so long. The accessibility, the access is so difficult.
It is. And you know what? It really would be better for society if everyone who was dealing with stuff had someone to talk to or help them through it, because then we would treat one another better. And I mean, I just feel like it would make all of society better if people didn't have untreated trauma inside of them.
Yeah.
Well,
We're approaching the end of the episode. Aisha, I want to ask you one more time. Tell us a little, what's your 30-second summary of things we don't talk about and some of the issues that you're covering?
So these are things that I wish that we did talk about, and things I wish minority communities in particular felt more comfortable asking questions about. And so I am that person who will bring experts on and ask them all the questions that you have. And so hopefully it will start a conversation, and it might start us thinking about, could this be something that someone I love or myself could benefit from?
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Friends, this is Aisha Sultan. She is a columnist at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and the producer of a 12-part series on 9 PBS in St. Louis, The Things We Don't Talk About. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Apollo says in his experience, finding good psychiatrists takes time, but is worth it. He lucked out when he paid out of pocket. So that's one option. And Jim says that you're making a difference.
Thank you.
So I think you're getting a little love from Jim as well.
That's
which
very
is
kind.
nice.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And my mom said earlier that you had a lot of guts to talk about mental health issues coming from the South Asian community. It must have stirred a lot of emotions
Yes,
when you did that.
it did. And thank you so much for appreciating and recognizing that. You must be very proud of your son.
I think she is.
Yes. Wonderful.
She shows up every show.
Yes.
I know you are, Mom. I know you are. I know you're proud. But hopefully folks will join us. Again, our next episode will be June 12th. And our guest, Jonathan Boorstein, will talk about mature adults and mental health challenges. Thank you again for joining us for Mental Health Awareness Month. And Aisha, good luck with the rest of the episodes and any other events you might have locally. We will stay in touch.
All right. Take care. Bye, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.